Good evening, one and all. Welcome to Radiology Grand Rounds from Kaveri Hospital. First of all, we would like to thank Dr. Manivannan, our Managing Director, who was instrumental to inspire all of us to start this academic event. Sir is a great clinician who's tech savvy with great focus on patient care. We'd like to thank our Group Medical Director, Dr. Suresh Venkita, who's a senior cardiologist with great worldwide experience and an expert on academic events. Most importantly, we'd like to thank our team of radiologists across various units in Trichy, Salem, Chennai, Bangalore, and Hosur, who took the time and effort to get cases for discussion. The pillar for this event is our radiology resident, Dr. Shabna, who compiled the clinical information, imaging findings, and coordinated with various consultants across specialties to prepare content for this grand rounds. So first we'll look at the history of grand rounds. We can trace it back to William Osler, the first professor of medicine, beginning in 1889. It was a physician-to-physician teaching forum to disseminate cutting-edge medical knowledge and was a collaborative approach at start. The patient and specific clinical problems were always the focus of discussion. Grand rounds demonstrates the best in evaluation and treatment of difficult clinical problems in real-life patients who often told their own story in an amphitheater like this. Over a period of time, it evolved, and this is a picture in the early 1900s. So instead of having real patient examination and all, so it turned out to be more like a discussion sort of program. This is a picture in 1962 of a medical grand rounds. The patient's findings, their X-ray images were discussed. More recently, it has turned to a monotonous presentation with no real patient focus. So this is an article which says, can we make grand rounds grand again? And we are trying to do that. So these are the objectives of our grand rounds. To showcase excellence in diagnostic and interventional radiology, to highlight recent medical advances, give updates in medical research, highlight expertise in the faculty, to encourage professional interaction, to educate residents and faculty, and also to mentor residents. So we'll have a series of cases which will be presented by our senior radiologists. We'll start with the first case by Professor Dr. S. Bob Peter from Kaveri, Chennai.
Good evening, all. So I'll be starting with the first case, and so this was a 19-year-old. It's not moving. This was a 19-year-old male who had presented with complaints of bilateral lower limb weakness and a blurring of vision in the left eye. So we have provided, you can see the T2 weighted sagittal images, the flare axial and the T2 weighted images of sections of the orbit and the midbrain are seen. So what do you see here? You can see there is an intramedullary hyperintensity which is seen extending from the cervicomedullary junction involving the cervical spinal cord. It's relatively bulky at this point. Some patchy hyperintensities are also noted in the upper dorsal cord. And in the axial images, you can see there is a focal hyperintensity in the left anterior midbrain or the cerebral peduncle. If you observe the orbits, and you can see the left optic nerve is relatively thickened, slightly hyperintense. So this is the constellation of findings that we are looking at here. So we will be thinking of possibilities of a demyelination. So and there was a contrast was done, and in the contrast, these are nothing but susceptibility artifacts due to the dentures which is there. You can see some patchy enhancement within the cord. And in the axial images, you can see this focal hyperintensity is seen involving the central portion of the cord, as well as the posterior portion of the cord. So this constellation of findings, and this is the sagittal image, and this is the T2-weighted sagittal image. So this pattern is a longitudinal extensive transverse myelitis pattern. Associated, we find there are some hyperintensities in the midbrain and in the optic nerve. So the possibilities may be, we'll be thinking of either a multiple sclerosis or a neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorder. Multiple sclerosis can be ruled out because of the presence of the longitudinal hyperintensity. Usually they are patchy and discrete. And in the axial images, you can see that in multiple sclerosis, they more often involve the lateral aspect of the cord. Here you find that the central gray matter is involved as well as the posterior aspect of the cord. So multiple sclerosis can be ruled out, and the corpus callosum and the callosocceptal interfaces were normal. It's very unusual for multiple sclerosis also to involve the left, the midbrain and the gray matter structures. So that leaves the possibility of either a neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorders. So these are classified into two types. Either it can be aquaporin antibody positive and aquaporin antibody negative spectrum disorders. It's sometimes difficult to differentiate both, but MR can provide certain clues. One of the clues is that the involvement of the NMO spectrum disorder with aquaporin antibody positive, they usually involve the periaqueductal gray matter, and in the regions of the putamen can be involved. Here the ventral midbrain is involved, and usually in neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorders, they can have bright hyperintensities in T2-weighted imaging. It's called bright spotty signals, signs. And these are the two possibilities. This patient was evaluated, and the CSF antibody was positive for the myelin oligodendrocyte glycoprotein, or the MOG IgG antibody was positive, and they were seronegative for aquaporin antibodies and oligoconal bands. The patient was started on azathioprine after the diagnosis of a neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorder with the aquaporin negative. So it was a myelin oligodendrocyte glycoprotein antibody positive disorders. So this is anti-myelin oligodendrocyte glycoprotein autoantibody seropositive. Patient after treatment, they came back after 4 weeks, and you can see in the whole spine image that the hyperintensity is relatively resolved compared to the previous scan, although there are some hyperintensities which are seen in the conus region. And in the axial images, the extent of the hyperintensities have also reduced. So this case is to highlight how the differential between multiple sclerosis and neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorder, and also how to differentiate neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorders MOG antibody from others. Usually the conus involvement is seen to be involved more commonly in the MOG antibody rather than the neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorder. And in the optic nerve, if contrast is given, usually perioptic enhancement is more common in the optic nerves. So this is the follow-up scan after the treatment, where you can even see the midbrain hyperintensity is resolved compared to it. So what is important from the patient's point of view is that the MOG antibody has a good, relatively better recovery compared to the neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorders, where it can progress to spinal cord atrophy and then. So this is a constellation of findings are being called by a few others as MONAM, or a MOG IgG associated optic neuritis, encephalitis, and myelitis. And this is the spectrum where anti-MOG antibody, they can present either as optic neuritis, encephalitis, and myelitis. Sometimes they can present as Adam-like picture with the aquaporin antibody negative. So moving on to the next case. So this was a patient who presented with back pain and weakness, and this is a T2-weighted sagittal image, and you can see here there is a posterior epidural lesion with a bit contrast enhancement that is causing spinal cord compression. The spinal diffusion micrography was done, shows displacement of the tracts anteriorly. No disruption of the tracts could be seen. You can see there is a deflection of the tract in the spinal diffusion tensor imaging. So looking at this, these images, and CT was done that shows focal areas of calcification within the lesion. The axial images also show intramedullary hyperintensities. And the differential diagnosis for this lesion can be either an epidural lesion, it can be a metastasis, could be a lymphoma, could be a meningiomas. And usually lymphomas are less likely to calcify. And other lesions can also occur, like fungal lesions. If associated bone marrow changes are there, like an aspergillosis or other fungal lesions, other possibilities. And these are the post-contrast images. You can see the avidly enhancing lesion and the axial images that show the displacement of the cord. And it's relatively hyperdense in the plain scan. So this patient was, surgery was done for this patient, and the biopsy came as meningioma. Meningothelial meningioma was the histopathological diagnosis. So meningiomas can be both intradural, extramedullary. It can also be epidural, which is not very common. So these are the common differential diagnoses that you would like to think of: meningiomas, lymphomas, metastasis. Schwannomas are intradural, extramedullary generally. So after the HP came as a meningothelial meningioma. So this was post-surgical images that show the complete removal of the lesion with some residual cord hyperintensities, which may be post-operative. So we saw two cases, and we saw the discussion. This third case is just to show you a simple case. And for those who are residents who are seeing, you can just, it is important to identify an aneurysm in the T2-weighted axial images or the flare axial images. You can see here the MC, and you can see a small phlovoid in the right MC with a Sylvian fissure hematoma. So this is an important localizing sign to identify. Whenever you see a hematoma in the Sylvian fissure, we have to suspect ruptured middle cerebral artery aneurysm. So that is, you can, and in the time of flight source image, angio image, you can see a small aneurysm here with the conical projection, which means that this has probably ruptured. There is also associated subarachnoid hemorrhage, which is evident in the flare images. These are the SWA images that shows the hematomas and in the subarachnoid hemorrhage. So this was a ruptured middle cerebral artery aneurysm with a hematoma, and that it is seen causing mass effect with midline shift in intraventricular hemorrhage. Thank you.
I'm Dr. Amir. This is about 80-year-old male patient who presented with pruritus for 2 weeks, and CT was done after medical gastroenterology opinion. Plain CT shows there is a lobulated and nodular liver surface, and there is a isodense mass sitting in the region of segment 5, and the contrast is done. This is the arterial phase contrast. We can see a blush in the arterial phase, and the mass is sitting at the alar region, but also compressing confluence of the hepatic duct, and patient also has got some IHBR dilatation. And we can see in the venous phase there is a relative washout when compared to the liver parenchyma, and delayed phase we can very well see the washout. Parenchyma. The size of the lesion was around 7.5 to 7.5 centimeter, and two tiny focal enhancement, nodular enhancement were also seen in other lobes, two nodular lesions, one in the left lobe and another one in the right lobe. So, incidentally for this patient, for clinical imaging diagnosis, in the background of cirrhosis, arterial phase enhancing with washout in the delayed phase or portal phase, hepatocellular carcinoma. So biopsy also confirmed the diagnosis, and so these are the features which I mentioned. And there are 3 phases of contrast enhancement, as you all know. Earlier arterial phase, it's in 25 seconds. This is for depicting the hepatic arterial anatomy prior to liver transplantation, hepatic resection, or depiction of the anatomical variations, vascular variations, and for interventions to look for the feeders of the vessels, and late arterial phase to detect and characterize vascular liver lesions, and portal phase to look for the washout, or in case of delayed enhancement in case of hemangioma, like that. So for that patient, initially there was, as I said, there was a compression of the confluence of the hepatic ducts. So the patient had very high bilirubin, for which they did a stenting. That is, plastic stent was done through ERCP. Once when the bilirubin has come down, then we plan for the TACE procedure, because this comes in the intermediate stage, BCLC stage. So this is tumor size of 7.5 centimeter, and considering the age of the patient was given planned for TASTE procedure. And this is a celiac angiogram. In the celiac angiogram, we can see this is the left branch, this is the right branch, and this is the segment 5 branch, which is feeding the lesion. And this is the lipidol doxorubicin mixture, which is percolated into the tumor after selectively entering this vessel. And we can see the tumor blush here. And this is a selective catheterization of the segment 5 vessel. And this vessel, you can see the percolation of the tumor envelope. Before the procedure, we see that this vessel is seen. After the procedure, we are completely normal. This is a good percolation of the chemotherapeutic agent into the tumor. And the rest of the vessels, like segment 6 and segment 7, doesn't show much of the figure. And from the segment 4, there was some supply to the tumor, which was also embolized separately. And this is another patient. This patient is a middle-aged patient, came with the complaints of muscle weakness, and CT was done for him. So there was a lobulated, well-defined lesion in the anterior mediastinum, and there is no other feature other than this. There are no features of invasion or invasion with adjacent vascular structures or pleural invasion. And there are no calcification or any necrotic features. This is the lesion in the anterior mediastinum. So for this, they've asked for the biopsy. So here we have, so instead of going in the parasternal location, because we have to puncture both the pleura, the chances of pneumothorax and hemothorax is very high. So if you go to the sternum, a bit easier. So here we avoid the pleural complications. So this was done through the transsternal approach. So you can see the needle here and biopsy taken from the lesion. So the diagnosis came as thymoma. So here it is a well-defined lesion, hypodense lesion in the anterior mediastinum, mild lobulated contour. The lesion abuts the pericardium along the right atrium and extends adjacent to the ascending aorta without any signs of invasion. This is the HPE feature, a thymoma type A. So, as you all know, thymoma is associated with myasthenia gravis. 10 to 20% of the patients with myasthenia gravis have thymoma. 30 to 50% of patients with thymoma have myasthenia gravis. Other associated features can be pure red cell aplasia, hypogammaglobulinemia, SLE, rheumatoid arthritis. So, differentials for the anterior mediastinomas, as we all know, that thymoma, teratoma, thyroid, retrosternal thyroid, and terrible lymphoma. So, differentiation in case of teratoma, we can see fat or calcification. Thyroid, we can trace the lesion from the neck. And lymphoma, when there is an associated nodal masses, other node masses is there, we can, by that we can, to some extent, come to the diagnosis of thymoma. Thymoma can have various thymic lesions can be many. Some of them are thymic cyst, thymic hyperplasia, thymic lymphoid follicular hyperplasia, non-invasive thymoma, thymolipoma, and thymic carcinoid, invasive thymoma, thymic carcinoma are some of the lesions which can arise from the thymus. So this is simple thymic hyperplasia. We can see the contour of the thymus is maintained and it's a triangular. So this is thymic hyperplasia. Here we can see it is a nodular, well-defined lesion without any signs of invasion. There are no calcification. This is simple non-invasive thymoma. Here we can see there is a pleural invasion, multiple pleural nodules are there. So it is an invasive thymoma. So calcification again suggests aggressiveness of the lesion. And here in this case, we can see there is a heterogeneity with areas of necrosis. This is thymic carcinoma with pleural invasion with the left pleural effusion. So thymic epithelial tumors, grading is done to some extent. Actually, it is an histopathological grading, but with CT we can grade the lesions to some extent. Type A lesions will be rounded, smooth with homogeneous enhancement without any invasion of adjacent structure. Type B lesions will have calcification, and type C lesions will have necrosis. Thymic carcinoma is otherwise called as type C lesions. So in our case, we had type A lesion, which was referred to cardiothoracic surgery, and they have excised the tumor.
Thank you, Dr. Ramesh. Next, we have a case from Dr. Santosh Kumar, who is an interventional radiologist at Salem College.
So can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Outside, I would like to thank the organizing committee for giving us to be on this platform. Can we move on to the slides, sir? First case. Thank you. Yes, so this patient is a 65-year-old male, non-hypertensive diabetic, presented with a history of giddiness since 12 o'clock in the noon. And when he had symptoms of right-sided weakness, upper and lower limb, speech disturbance since 5:30 in the evening. He presented to the ER at 7:40 within the window period. This patient was a case of stroke and presented to ER within 4.5 hours. He presented before 2 hours. His BP was 190/100 and his NHS score was 16, which is a major stroke. Any score more than 6 is considered to be a major stroke. And his power in right upper and lower limb was 0, and he was FSC. And this is the case history. And as per protocol, the patient underwent a CT scan to rule out any hemorrhage. This was the plain CT brain axial sections, which show these are the multifocal small black areas. We call it as hypoattenuation. So these are all the infarcts, multifocal infarcts. Especially this is the area where anterior cerebral artery supplies, and this is the area where middle cerebral artery supplies. These infarcts are at the junction of anterior cerebral and middle cerebral artery, confined to the left side of the internal cerebral artery. Internal carotid artery. This is the angiogram done, which showed this is the left internal common carotid artery. And this is the internal carotid artery origin, this is the external carotid artery. There was a severe stenosis at this point in the left internal carotid artery origin, along with the plaque. So patient also had a thrombus, free-floating thrombus. Usually previously, whenever the patient has a free-floating thrombus, the management goes as a conservative one. Since the patient had a major stroke and we could so this is the origin of the left internal carotid. We could see there is a severe stenosis, which is nicely seen here. The lumen is more than 90% compromised. We could only see a thin strand of contrast going along with. Along with stenosis, we could see this is the thrombus. The white area is a free-floating thrombus within the. So critical stenosis with free-floating thrombus. Since the patient presented to us within a window period and he didn't have much of infarct in the left-sided cerebral hemisphere, we plan to go ahead with the carotid stenting, emergency carotid stenting. So next slide. So this was the left middle cerebral artery. The anterior cerebral was getting supplied from the opposite side. So this is the middle cerebral. We don't find any much of occlusion or narrowing in the left middle cerebral artery. The next slide. Yeah. So this was the initial picture, and we placed the guiding catheter within the left common carotid artery, and this was the stent deployed across the narrowed segment of the internal carotid artery. So this is the proximal part and deployed. This is the distal part of the stent, and this is the post-stenting. This is the pre and post-stenting image. Post-stenting, there was no migration of any thrombus into the middle cerebral artery. Next slide, sir. So this was the pre-stenting and this is the post-stenting. So complete recanalization of the restoration of the caliber of the left internal carotid was achieved. So from here the stent is extending and across the left internal carotid, it has completely covered the narrowing and it has opened up the narrowing. Next slide, sir. So on day 2, he showed improvement in power, almost 4/5 in the lower limb. And he regained his speech. And so, can you play this video? Yes. This is the day 2. He can able to walk with support on day 2 of the procedure. On first visit after 1 week, he had a complete restoration of power from 0 to 5/5. So emergency stroke management is very crucial, patient selection, and this patient benefited very well with our stenting. Yes, sir. So we'll move on to our next case. So this is a 23-year-old female, recent postpartum, day 22. She underwent puerperal sterilization. After 8 days of puerperal sterilization, she noticed right lower limb swelling. So she was subjected to Doppler, which showed a right iliofemoropoplar DVT with extension into the IVC. So CT venogram was done. Next slide. So this was the CT venogram picture. The axial image, we can see that this is the IVC completely filled with thrombus extending from the right lower limb, just moved almost just 5 centimeters short of right atrium. So the IVC will go into right atrium here, somewhere here. So only we could see only just 5 centimeter portion. Once if the thrombus goes into the heart, there is a high chance the patient will go for a major pulmonary thromboembolism. So since the patient had huge load of thrombus, she was planned for IVC filter replacement and mechanical thrombectomy. So this was the IVC filter. From the jugular vein, we placed a suprarenal IVC filter. These are all the kidneys. We could see the contrast within the kidneys. The IVC filter was deployed into the suprarenal segment of IVC here, and mechanical thrombectomy was done by puncturing the popliteal vein, and catheter was taken into the IVC. So this is the IVC filter here, and this is the contrast through the recanalized IVC after mechanical thrombectomy. So next slide. Okay, sir, can you go to the previous slide, sir? Next one, sir. Okay, fine, sir. So this patient, we removed a significant amount of thrombus, and this patient was kept on catheter-directed thrombolysis. Altiplase was injected overnight, and the patient was observed in ICU. This is the catheter which was kept within the popliteal vein. It went into the IVC, catheter-directed thrombolysis. Next one, sir. So this next day we could able to aspirate significant amount of thrombus. This was the aspirated clot on the first day. After mechanical thrombectomy after thrombolysis, almost this amount of thrombus was removed from the IVC as well as from the iliac veins. And these are the clinical picture. Initially, she had a diameter of 50 at this level above the knee, and within 3-4 days of procedure, her leg edema significantly decreased to 44. From 50, it came to 44. Next one, sir. And she was started on systemic anticoagulation in view of extensive DVT as per protocol, and switched to oral warfarin subsequently on day of the procedure. So she was stable throughout the hospital stay, and this is post-procedure after 10 days of procedure. She can able to walk independently. She was able to carry out her activities without any help. And the advantage of mechanical thrombectomy is there is a prompt resolution of symptoms of lower limb swelling, and we can prevent pulmonary thromboembolism by placing IVC filter. It also restores normal venous circulation. The important thing is it preserves venous valvular function, and whenever patient develops extensive DVT, there is a high chance that valvular venous valves will get damaged, and the patient will definitely land up in varicose vein problem. By doing mechanical thrombectomy within a stipulated time, we can preserve the venous valvular function, and we can prevent the post-thrombotic symptoms. Thank you. Sir, can we move on to next case? This is my third case. This is a 21 years young nurse, female patient with left leg pain, which was aggravated on prolonged standing during her work. This was the vague swelling here, which was not visible clinically, and she, with suspicion of some soft tissue swelling, the patient underwent an MRI. These are the stir images. We could see there is a hyperintense lesion very close to the periosteum within the muscular compartment. This is the tibia, this is fibula. The anterior compartment of midline, we can see the multiple flow voids. These are all flow voids. This is very typical of vascular malformation, and CT correlation showed a speck of calcification. So calcification flow-wards, the patient was subjected for Doppler, which showed a high flow with mixture of arterial as well as venous flow here, we can see. So based on these imaging findings, vascular malformation was suspected and the patient was subjected for angiogram. During angiogram, we couldn't find any shunting. So this was the anterior tibial angiogram. So here we could see there is a needle was placed under ultrasound guidance to localize this lesion percutaneously, so that we don't want to miss any findings. So with the localization from outside and we injected contrast through the anterior tibial, we do not find any much of a shunting, arteriovenous shunting in the from the anterior tibial artery. So what we did was we did the intra-op ultrasound. So can you, this was the intra-operative ultrasound. So these are all the anoic black channels. We call this is the vascular channels within the lesion. So we punctured this lesion percutaneously and we took a nidogram. We call it as nidogram. Percutaneous puncture of these black channels, vascular channels, and nidogram was taken. This is the nidus of the lesion and it was draining into the vein. So this is the vein. So we put a beefy cup in the lower thigh to occlude this vein and we injected sclerosant. This is a foamed sclerosant which was injected percutaneously. We could see this is the intra-procedure ultrasound. We could nicely see this uniform spread of the sclerosant within the lesion. So next slide. This is the normal color flow within the anterior tibial artery as well as anterior tibial vein during the procedure. So there was no complication related to artery and vein. Next one, sir. So this was the post-procedure follow-up scan. We could nicely see these are the echogenic contents such as thrombus within the vascular channels of the lesion here, and there was no any abnormal color flow within the lesion. So we could able to easily tackle this lesion percutaneously since there was no endovascular option in this patient. Next one, sir. So she becomes symptomatically better post-procedure and there was no pain on standing. We are planning to do follow-up Doppler every 3 months to assess the further improvement or the development of new lesion in this patient. So we will move on to our next case. This is a 62-year-old female, known rheumatic heart disease, mitral valve stenosis. She underwent a valvuloplasty. She was on anticoagulation for this mitral valve stenosis and valvuloplasty, non-hypertensive, coronary artery disease, recent anterior wall MI. She had so many comorbidities. She presented with right-sided weakness and speech disturbance since 9 o'clock in the morning. From outside the hospital, she was evaluated with MRI and she was referred. When she reached our hospital, almost from the symptom onset, 6.5 hours have elapsed already. Her BP was 150/90 and the NIHS score was 12, suggestive of major stroke. And same power in the right upper and lower was 0 and she was aphasic. So, can we move? These are all the axial weighted, diffusion weighted images and corresponding ADC. So we could see periventricular ischemic area here. This is black on this is apparent diffusion coefficient image, and this is the diffusion. We could see this developing ischemia or infarct here. We don't have a major infarct in the left middle cerebral artery, and here we could see there is a cutoff. This is the normal right middle cerebral artery. We could see nicely the branches. Here the left middle cerebral artery M1, beyond this M1 segment, we don't find any artery at all. There is an abrupt cutoff. There is an occlusion of the left middle cerebral artery M1 segment. So being a major vessel stroke and the patient didn't have much of infarct since the patient was within a window period, like extended window period. The patient was taken up for angiogram with possible mechanical thrombectomy. This was the left internal carotid artery injection. Here this is the left anterior cerebral and this is the left middle cerebral. There is an abrupt cutoff. We don't find any vessels at all beyond this point. So we could able to pass the mechanical thrombectomy catheter. This is the mechanical thrombectomy catheter here, this round one, and we could able to aspirate the thrombus from this middle cerebral artery. So next slide. The middle cerebral artery is completely opened up. This is called TICI 3. So complete opening up of the middle cerebral artery. Branches were nicely opaced. There were no filling defects. Next one, sir. So on day 2, she had a good improvement of power. This, since she could not able to walk and she was on anticoagulant, this picture nicely shows she can able to lift her upper and lower limbs, and she regained her speech and her power improved to 5/5. Next one, sir. So this was the video taken from her home during follow-up visit. She can able to walk and she is leading a normal life after this major stroke. Thank you, sir. Shall we move on to our last case? Yes. Thank you. So this is a 59-year-old female, non-diabetic. She presented with pain, abdomen, vomiting for 2 days, and she didn't have any history of previous surgery. So with clinical suspicion of a bowel obstruction, patient underwent CT abdomen. This was the topogram. So we can correlate this topogram with our X-ray. So we can nicely see multiple dilated bowel in the center of the abdomen here. So suggests to a small bowel obstruction. So this is the axial CT video. We can see heart, liver here. So there is abnormal clustering of bowel loops. We should not normally see bowel loops anterior to liver. This is abnormal clustering of bowel loops anterior to the liver. As we move down, here the superior mesenteric artery and vein, we can able to see the passage of artery and vein along with mesentery across the transverse colon. So here there is a transverse colon. Across the transverse colon and through the transverse colon, mesocolon, there is a passage of omentum. So again, the dilated proximal bowel loops. There was no free air, so we move on to the coronal sections. So same patient in the coronal view, multiple dilated loops. We can see nicely. See here there is a extension of the bowel loop into the perihepatic region, right subdiaphragmatic perihepatic location. So based on these findings, small bowel obstruction due to internal hernia was suspected. There was no free air. A small bowel obstruction with transition at medial ileum. There is abnormal clustering of dilated ileal loops in the right upper quadrant in the subdiaphragmatic space around the antero-superior surface of the liver, with extension of mesenteric vessels through the transverse mesocolon. This is the catchy finding here. There was no interference. So possibility of mesocolic transomental hernia was given. There was minimal free fluid. There was no free air. The patient underwent surgery. Laparotomy was done, and on intra findings, there was a transomental hernia. Through the omentum, there was extension of the mesentery along with the bowel loops, with adherent dilated small bowel loops in right subdiaphragmatic perihepatic space with pus plate. So this is a very rare case of Pitsu-Kuti syndrome, which means there is a chronic PAD which leads to perihepatitis and the bowel obstruction. So among various causes of small bowel obstruction, internal hernia is very rare. So it comes less than 5% of small bowel obstruction. Among these internal hernias, this transomental hernia is very, very rare again. Among these, like 5% of small bowel obstruction, transomental hernia constitutes only 1 to 4% of the total hernia. And here again, the patient with perihepatitis and causing adhesion and obstruction, which is called as Pitsu-Kuti syndrome, is a very rare presentation of bowel obstruction. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Santosh. There was a wonderful demonstration of arterial and venous interventions, and also this rare case presentation. Next, we move on to our case. I am Dr. Ayappan from Kaveri, Chennai. So, this is a 4-year-old boy with a recurrent swelling and pain in the left knee. So, this is right knee for comparison, the sagittal view. This is the patella here, the quadriceps tendon. So, in the suprapatellar region, there is no fluid collection. Here on the left side, if you see, the there is an anechoic lesion. It's probably a thickened synovium in the left suprapatellar region. So this is the lateral region. So we see there's a thickened synovium, which is a hypoechoic. And on Doppler, there is no significant increase in vascularity, which is also confirmed with the power Doppler. We see the normal surrounding tissues, they pick up flow, whereas within the thickened synovium, there is no flow. So it's a patient with a juvenile idiopathic arthritis. And this is the infrapatellar fat pad or the Hoffa's fat pad. On the left side, there is increased echogenicity, whereas on the right side, it is normal. So types of JAA, oligoarticular with less than 4 joints involvement and predominantly large and medium sized joints, and the polyarticular JAA with more than 5 joint involvement involving small joints, and systemic onset disease or Still's disease with fever, hepatosplenomegaly, and skin rashes, which is a bit rare. The ultrasound findings in active disease in JAA are synovial thickening, increase in vascularity, and effusion. So if there is active disease, then they may require intra-articular steroid. So when the patient is young, really young, infant, it will be a bit difficult to differentiate between a joint fluid, synovial thickening, and epiphyseal cartilage. All these will appear hypoechoic or anechoic. So how to differentiate? We look at the echo texture. It will be a variable in joint fluid and synovial thickening, and it will be anechoic in epiphyseal cartilage when it is not ossified. And we look at the compressibility. The cartilage will not be compressible. The synovial thickening will be minimally compressible, whereas the joint fluid will be fully compressible, and it will redistribute. And we can also check at the vascularity, which will be absent in joint fluid and epiphyseal cartilage, whereas in the synovial thickening there can be minimal vascularity. So ultrasound is also useful to differentiate between JAA and septic arthritis or osteoarticular infections. And clinically, if you see presentation for JAA, it's usually more than 6 weeks of symptoms. And the extent of involvement, it can be multifocal or symmetric, whereas septic arthritis is usually monoarticular. And bone changes are more common in JAA. And overlying soft tissue changes can be seen in both JAA or in septic arthritis. In JAA, it will be presenting as a tenosynovitis with increase in flow on Doppler and also in decrease in echogenicity. You can also get enthesiopathy or bursitis. Other findings like rice bodies can be seen in JAA. So that's about JAA. Next case is just about intraoperative ultrasound, how we do in our hospital. So technically, you can either use a mobile ultrasound, or we can use like this type of standalone ultrasound machine. We've got an UPS in the backup, just for backup, because in theater, when you have multiple cables running around, it's very easy to get the tripped and will lose images. So we use a sort of backup, or otherwise you can use a mobile ultrasound. But the problem is most of the mobile ultrasound machines have limited resolution. So we use this probe. It's a variable frequency linear transducer with a wide field of view. It's a 4 to 15 megahertz transducer, hockey stick probe. It's a very thin footprint. We have an additional holder which can be autoclaved. So we sterile this probe and then use this sort of cover for the probe. Cheaper one will be like this sort of arthroscopic cover, costs only 20 to 30 rupees. And after sterilizing, we can use a sterile jelly, or we can use locks within, because even if it leaks, it won't contaminate. Mainly we use here for liver transplant Doppler. So we should know a bit of anatomy here. So we have either DDLT or the diseased donor liver transplant, and the LDLT or the living donor liver transplant. In diseased donors, we have two techniques. One is the conventional technique where there is end-to-end anastomosis of the IVC, or we have commonly the piggyback technique where a part of the donor IVC is sewed side to side with the recipient IVC. So the surgical detail we should know from the surgeon before doing the ultrasound. And in LDLT, either we give the right lobe or the left lobe. Right lobe mainly for adults and left lobe for kids. So usually the middle hepatic vein stays with the donor. The middle hepatic vein branches, they reconstructed either using a graft or directly, and then anastomosed. And the right portal and the right hepatic artery, these are anastomosed. In left lobe liver transplantation also, the middle hepatic vein will remain with the donor, and usually there is no reconstruction of the left portal vein. So these are the three areas where we look. First is the hepatic artery. So the normal hepatic artery RI is between 0.55 to 0.8. In renal transplant, it's very important to see this high RI, which may be sign of late rejection. Whereas in liver transplant Doppler, a low RI has more significance, but because it will indicate an upstream stenosis. So hepatic artery stenosis or thrombus is a very dangerous complication, which will necessitate immediate reopening. So this is a hepatic artery Doppler. We look for flow. In the during the surgery and in the immediate post-op period, there can be some amount of swelling and inflammation around that region, and there can be a focal stenosis. So even if you find minimal flow, it is good enough. Similarly, with the portal vein, the region of anastomosis, the patient may be having a big portal vein, so there will be discrepancy in the size at the anastomotic site, and there can be increased flow, which may not be very significant. Just detecting flow is good enough. If there is any thrombus, then we should immediately notify the surgeon. The third thing which we look is the hepatic vein in the IVC. So this is the right hepatic vein IVC junction. So the normal hepatic vein and the IVC have a triphasic flow pattern. It can be biphasic or monophasic. If there is sufficient flow, it is good enough. So we will look at these three findings. If you don't have a Hockey probe, we can use a curvilinear probe itself with a sterile cover. So this is about the intraoperative liver transplant Doppler protocol. We have Dr. Senthilvel Murugan, senior consultant radiologist from Kaveri, Trichy.
Good evening, everybody. I thank Dr. Manivanan sir and Ayyappan and Suresh sir for making this to happen. It's a very nice platform because we are doing so much of work, but we are not able to showcase our work. So I will show a very simple cases, just a spotter-like thing. So this is a 20-year-old boy who came here with ankle swelling with pain, severe pain. Pain is the main thing. And straight away, orthopedician referred for MR, and we did, and we were able to find out fluid collection in the tibial joint with multiple loose bodies around it. And few loose bodies are also seen in between in the joint space also. This is the sagittal and this is the axial thing. See, you are able to see the multiple loose bodies. So surgery also. So this is we gave it as there are 2-3 close DDs are there, and first thing, because this boy is having he's a footballer, he is having multiple minor traumas and a major trauma 3 months back while playing, and we gave it as a synovial chondromatosis and pigmented villonodular synovitis as the next step. But synovial chondromatosis is more hard for this case because there is a history of trauma, and these multiple loose bodies are very classical of synovial chondromatosis, and there is no other finding. The rest of the bones are appears normal. And surgery was also done for this case, and it multiple they taken around 40 to 50 loose bodies from this, and the patient is now fine. So there are two types of synovial chondromatosis. One is the primary, and another one is the secondary. Primary usually there won't be any cause, and it is idiopathic. And secondly, the important cause is the trauma. Some history of trauma will be there, and usually it is very minor. Next. This is another interesting case we not very oftenly see. A 7-month-old child with complaints of abnormal body movements for 4 to 5 episodes per day from since birth. A normal delivery, sudden crying with upward gaze, sometimes it will be there, and development also looks normal. And Ashley spots is there. This is one clinical finding. Then we did use the abdomen echo and everything we did after a MRI, and their clinical diagnosis is myoclonic incest. And we did MR and this T2 weighted sequence shows there are T2 hyperintensity predominantly in the subcortical region. And we did both contrast and plain and contrast MR, and this post contrast study shows there are enhancing nodules within these hyperintensities. And simultaneously, we are able to see multiple nodular enhancement and otherwise nodules enhancing in the periventricular or subependymal regions on both. So it is a classical of the subcortical tubers and subependymal nodules with Ashley spot. It is a classical diagnosis of tuberous sclerosis. So we should be able to identify the clinical point which give the before MR is also very classical, but before that I thought the clinician told me Ashley spots are there. Then I set my mind, I working towards the tuberous sclerosis, and all the findings regarding the tuberous sclerosis are there. And because the baby is very small, we are not able to get any calcifications or any ependymomas. If it's done, or it picked up late, we will get ependymomas and other classical findings. Usually, why we did for ultrasound abdomen and echocardiogram, usually it is associated with renal angiomyolipomas in the abdomen and rhabdomyomas in the heart. So always we should work it out, and we are able to pick up the definitive criteria. There are a lot of criteria are there to fulfill that. We have to do at least minimum of MR with ultrasound abdomen and the echocardiogram. Next case. And this is a very simple case, and this is a spotter, and this is mainly for non-radiologist. This patient was referred to me for COVID screening, and we are doing more than 50 to 60 cases for COVID screening daily. Just I see that patient came to the cardiac center for chest pain, and every case coming before admission, they are getting COVID screening. So I able to pick up this, and there is a calcification. There is a calcification in the center of the aorta. What it shows. Then I saw that canogram, and there is a two linear line. This is the normal aorta, descending thoracic aorta, and then you are able to see a clearly dense white calcified line here. So the intimal calcification. So what will be the calcification? That mostly, and it is very linear, is the possibility of intimal calcification. And immediately I told the consultant, it looks like dissection. So we want to do angiogram. Next slide. So it is a type 1 dissection involving the entire aorta and extending up to the aortic bifurcation and left common iliac artery. So the simple thing is picking up that calcification is very, very important. So in the center of the aorta, calcification won't come, except the only DD is the thrombosis with calcification. But if it is a thrombosis, if it is acute one, definitely the size of the aorta will be increased. If it's a normal sized aorta with calcification in the midline, definitely we have to think of aortic dissection. Next. So this is called shifting calcium site. So this usually we used to teach the students that this is very important, because of the single clue we are able to save a patient. So timely we have to see. Whenever the chest X-ray is oftenly taken, whenever the patient comes. Now we are doing the CT test. Otherwise, usually we will do chest X-ray as one of the screening or a baseline procedure. So we should be able to identify the shifting of the calcium. That is called shifting calcium site. nowadays we are very rarely seeing the X-ray, but with the scanogram itself we have to able to identify. Because I detected, then only we did inform them, we did angiogram and we found that it was a complete dissection, type 1 DBK type 1 dissection. Next. So only two images, only representative images I given. This is the abdominal pain, and on examination there is a mass. I not seen the patient, I seen only CT scan, and there is a large hypodense mass lesion in the right iliac fossa region. And this is the arterial phase, because there is aorta is enhancing, this is the arterial phase, and similarly small nodular density is enhancing within the lesion. And if you are closely watched, there are multiple hyperdensities within the surrounding lesion also. This is the venous phase or delayed phase where it is not at all, and the hyperdensity with enhanced is not seen, but it's seen as a faint staining, and multiple hyperdensities also seen there. So this is a pseudoaneurysm with a large hematoma around it. This is a pseudoaneurysm with a large hematoma around it. We not done any angiogram, thus only a contrast CT scan. We told patient left. Patient is patient not willing for the other procedure. They left yesterday, day before yesterday only we did. But this is a pseudoaneurysm with adjacent hematoma. Commonly in the right iliac fossa region, there are possibilities of people having any form of inflammatory disease, usually diverticulitis. Then ileocholic artery pseudoaneurysm is more common. So we are not confined, we are not concluded it's like that, but there is a possibility because the other pancreas and other pancreas is normal. In pancreatitis also pseudoaneurysm and hematomas are more common. Here this is a closed DD. I thought it was maybe a diverticulitis with the pseudoaneurysm of the ileocholic artery with surrounding large hematoma. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next we have Dr. Perikirpan, interventional neuroradiologist from Kaveri, Chennai.
Good evening. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizing team for interacting with across the faculty Kaveri chain of hospitals. This is a patient, 20 or 23-year-old lady with a secondary postpartum hemorrhage. She underwent LSES for breech presentation, after which she presented after 10 or 12 days with progressive postpartum hemorrhage with a hemoglobin of around 4. She was immediately referred for endovascular management. It was picked up on Doppler, which showed a anechoic lesion within the endometrium, which is a pseudoaneurysm, classical spotter from a postgraduate perspective. Next slide. Okay, it was referred from outside. You could see they had a doubt with the Doppler whether it's a pseudoaneurysm or some other only just retained products of consumption. MR was done. It showed a signal void. It's a flow void in the lower aspect of the uterine cavity with adjacent hematoma surrounding it. So classical of a pseudoaneurysm. Not necessarily for further investigation. If a ultrasound or a Doppler shows a pseudoaneurysm, we can directly take up for intervention. This is an angiogram which showed a pseudoaneurysm from the distal portion of the uterine artery, which was catheterized with microcatheter and microwire. There are two ways of treating this uterine pseudoaneurysm. One is with a liquid embolic agent. Liquid embolic agent, either you could use a glue. When you are not able to reach very near to the aneurysm, you can inject glue. The disadvantage with glue is you need to be at least close beyond the vesicovaginal branches. Otherwise, patient will have a dyspareunia. You should know the percentage of glue, what percentage it has to be injected. If it reflexes, the catheter gets clogged. It's difficult to remove the microcatheter. This patient, we put multiple coils since we are not able to reach up to the distal portion of the aneurysm. We have placed multiple 1/8 coils. This is one of other treatment option. The advantage with coil is there is no chance of reflex into the adjacent internal iliac branches. Even if a vesicovaginal branch gets occluded, it gets recanalized through other route. If glue enters, it will not recanalize. If a coil is placed, it will recanalize because it's induces a gradual thrombosis. You could see when doing a microcatheter injection, there is active leak from the pseudoaneurysm into the endometrial cavity. through the vagina, the contrast is leaking. So during microcatheter cannulation and injection, we should control our pressure. Otherwise, these pseudoaneurysms could give way. This is before and after. This is internal iliac angiogram. This is one catheter, Robert uterine catheter. Previously, it was coming from Cook. Now they are stopped because of the Beacon tip, which was getting detached. Now, a few other companies manufacture. This is one of uterine, rather than postpartum hemorrhage, either primary or a secondary. This uterine artery embolization is a good treatment option, even in a primary postpartum hemorrhage, even without pseudoaneurysms, rather than going for hysterectomy in a younger patient or a middle-aged female. If uterine artery embolization is done, if it is a primary PPH without pseudoaneurysm, we have to use either a gel foam, which will, the patient will be planned to conceive later. That is an advantage of using a gel foam. Gel foam is a temporary agent which will control the bleeding immediately. The patient will not have any further bleeding after 2 weeks. Normal menstrual cycle will be restored. When it is associated with a vascular pathology like a pseudoaneurysm or an iatrogenic AVM secondary to cesarean section or DNC, then in that case, we need to use either a liquid embolic agent or a coil. If it is an AVM, it is much better to use a liquid embolic agent glue. Only we need to control to prevent its entry into the IVC. This is post-procedure ultrasound. Patient wants to be very sure. Patient came from a outside different hospital. So before discharge, they want to be very sure it's totally occluded. You could see this is the anechoic sac, which was seen well. Now it has shrunken in size. There is a coil artifact also over here. This is a coil artifact. Thank you. This is from postgraduate perspective, uterine artery embolization, not only for BPH. Fibroid, we should be aggressive, competing with the physicians. Otherwise, we will lose this field. For everything, they will do a myomectomy. This is a safer option. The patient can come in the morning, go same day, evening, like in Western standards, we can practice. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next, we have cases from Dr. Jay Bharati, Senior Consultant Radiologist from Kaveri, Chennai.
Hi, good evening. Our first patient was a middle-aged male. He was having mental confusion and he had low GCS. But outside reports show positive RT-PCR for coronavirus. He also had a chest CT which showed typical COVID pneumonia, which was of mild to moderate severity. And so, for evaluation of the mental confusion, we did a brain and axial sections, and there were the basal ganglia show bilateral, symmetrical hypodensity involving the medial thalami with a rim of hyperintensity, and also with surrounding moderate white matter edema. And in the context of positive RT-PCR for coronavirus and also COVID pneumonia, it made a diagnosis of viral hemorrhagic encephalitis. Okay, this is the DD for bilateral medial thalamic lesions. We have number of conditions. The vascular could be the deep cerebral vein thrombosis, and arterial could be the artery of peritoneal occlusion, top of Bessler syndrome, and infection could be CJD viral encephalitis, of which COVID and dengue also will fall into the place. Autoimmune have limbic encephalitis, ADEM, and metabolic may have extrapontine demyelination, Wernicke's encephalopathy, and neoplasms have bilateral thalamic low-grade glioma. Congenital, very rare, and was not seen. And coming to CNS viral infections, HSV, herpes simplex viral infections usually affect the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. HIV will be usually in the periventricular and deep white matter. JU also affects the thalami, basal ganglia, and the pons. Dengue again the bilateral thalami, pons, and medulla. And CJD also the basal ganglia. Next patient there was a 14-year-old male, young boy, who presented with the difficulty in walking and ataxia. Again, he also tested to be COVID RT-PCR positive. So for further evaluation, we did a brain and a whole spine study with plain and contrast images. The brain did not reveal any abnormal findings, but in the spine axial sections, we can see the T1 axial pre-contrast and the post-hoc contrast images. We could see that there's brisk enhancement of the cauda equina. So in the context of difficulty in walking with brisk enhancement of the cauda equina and also the conus, a diagnosis of Guillain-Barré syndrome was made. And since he was RT-PCR positive, we wanted to see how was the chest findings. To a surprise, he did not have any the typical peripheral subpleural patches, but instead he have left lower lobe bronchiectasis with bronchial wall thickening and peribronchial nodules. Maybe this is also a finding of COVID pneumonia. We don't know or we're to study. So GBS is autoimmune polyradiculopathies involve the sensory, motor, and autonomic nerves. Usually they present with the progressive flaccid paralysis, and predisposing factors could be the post-viral lymphoma or SLE. Clinically, they present with symmetrical ascending muscle paralysis. And radiological findings depends upon the contrast enhancement of the conus and the cauda equina. We have seen in the recent past multiple complications of COVID, of which the neurological complications are not concomitant, of which we have seen axonemic polyneuropathy, myopathy, rhabdomyolysis, and we have seen multifocal ischemic because of the acute thrombosis of the internal canal arteries, cerebrovenous thrombosis, encephalopathies, and hemorrhagic encephalitis. These two cases are presented here to outline the neurological complications of COVID, of which hemorrhagic encephalitis is very dangerous and morbid also. Our next patient was 18-year-old male, but he had a sudden onset of frank bleeding PR. He did not have any other comorbids, no previous illnesses or any other illnesses. And CT access sections was done of the abdomen, pre and post contrast. They are able to see a well marginated lesion with mild enhancement outlining the mesenteric border of the jejunum. This lesion had small lobulations. There was no any surrounding inflammation, no locoregional lymphadenopathy. No other significant findings were seen in the abdomen except for small mesenteric nodes. There is no evidence of luminal compromise or bowel obstruction, and differential diagnosis of small bowel gastrointestinal stromal tumor or ectopic pancreas was suggested. The patient was taken up for surgery, and at the surgery, we could see that this is the lesion joining the jejunal loop. It is nicely seen here. And the HPE, after the HPE, we showed pancreatic ascending duct, suggesting a diagnosis of ectopic pancreas. So, what is ectopic pancreas? It's the presence of pancreatic tissue in the submucosal, muscularis, or subseral layers of the entire GI tract, and it lies outside the normal confines of the pancreas and does not lack any anatomical vascular connection to the main pancreas. It's the common locations being the proximal duodenum, gastric antrum, proximal jejunum. Of these, the last two are very rare. And normal imaging findings are intramural oval mass with ill-defined and maculabrated margins. The attenuation enhancement depend upon the histological composition. And the main hallmark of ectopic pancreas is central umbilication, which represents the rudimentary duct. The complications of ectopic pancreas also are same like pancreatitis, pseudocyst, and malignant degeneration. There is one such image which shows an ectopic pancreas with inflammation, and there's the jejunal wall thickening and surrounding inflammation. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Next we have Dr. Kanagasabai, consultant radiologist from Kaveri, Chennai.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to present in this forum. My first case, a young male presented with cough pain on the left side. This is the angiogram image. MIP image, you can see the complete occlusion of the left popliteal artery. So the patient was diagnosed as left popliteal artery thrombosis. This is a source image. This is arterial and venous space. You can see the thrombus within the left popliteal artery. So in this image, you can see there is an usually the medial head of gastrocnemius arises from the medial epicondyle. So there is an abnormal origin of the medial head of gastrocnemius from the lateral aspect. The abnormality was present on both the sides, but it was more on the left side. You can see there is no obvious thrombosis noted on the right side. So this is a case of popliteal artery thrombus due to popliteal artery entrapment. So we did a Doppler on the right side. So this is a Doppler picture showing the triphasic pattern on the popliteal artery. This is the neutral position. When the patient was made to do flexion on plantar flexion on resistant, we can see the increased resistance on the right side. So this indicates the patient has functional popliteal artery entrapment on the right side, even though it is not depicted on the CT. So the patient underwent surgery. The surgery was done on both the sides to release the abnormal insertion. So the diagnosis for this case is popliteal artery entrapment type 2. So a few points about popliteal artery entrapment. There are mostly common due to anatomical variants of either a popliteal vessels or the medial head of gastrocnemius. Type 1 is due to aberrant medial course of popliteal artery. Second one, as we saw in our case, this is due to abnormal lateral insertion of gastrocnemius. Third one is accessory slip of the medial head of gastrocnemius. Fourth one is entrapment by a fibrous or a popliteus band. And fifth one, both the popliteal artery and venous are entrapped. So the important point is, even if we see a popliteal artery thrombosis in a young patient on one side, we should suspect on the other side. Especially we have to do a Doppler and confirm the findings so that surgery can be done on both sides. The Doppler should not be done on the side of thrombosis to prevent migration and thromboembolism. My second case, a 54-year-old male came with complaints of headache. Actually, he came with, he had a seizure. He had a heavy bout of alcohol. After that, he developed a dehydration and a seizure. He was treated outside for 3 to 4 days and was managed symptomatically for seizures. Now he presented with headache. This is axial MR, non-contrast MRI, T1, T2, and flare images. You can see a lobulator hyperintense lesion with surrounding edema noted on the right high frontoparietal region. The lesion is hyperintense on both T1 and T2 weighted images. You can see the low ADC within the lesion, and this is a SW image. You can see the areas of blooming within the lesion. So the diagnosis is a hematoma in the late subacute. Since it is hyperintense on both T1 and T2, it's a late subacute hematoma. We did the flare images. You can see the hyperintensity within the suprasagittal sinus extending into the vena cava bilaterally, more prominent on the right side. And this is the MR venogram showing loss of fluid within the suprasagittal sinus. So the case of suprasagittal sinus thrombosis with hematoma. So the signs in imaging include a non-enhanced CT. You can see a dense clot sign at the expected level of the venous sinus. And CT venogram, there will be peripheral enhancement giving empty delta sign. And MR venogram, there will be absence of in MRI there will be absence of normal flow void, and MR venogram there will be signal loss. So whenever a patient presents with non-traumatic hemorrhage, the common differential include hypertension, tumor, vascular malformation, venous infarct, and amyloid angiopathy. The most common is hypertension. It's more common in the basal ganglia. Other areas include a cerebellum. Usually, they are more commonly located in the expected location. Amyloid angiopathy in a normotensive patient presenting with lobar hemorrhage, we have to think of amyloid angiopathy, can be present with microhemorrhages. The third diagnosis of venous infarct. In any case of a non-typical, atypical hematoma, we have to do a venogram for venous sinus thrombosis. And the other causes include vascular malformation and tumor. We have to do when there is an absence of venous infarct, we have to do a contrast to rule out any vascular malformation, but we have to follow up the hematoma to rule out any underlying mass lesion. A few words about aging of hematoma and MRI. So the hematoma can be hyperacute, acute, subacute, and chronic based upon the content of the hemoglobin. When it is intracellular oxyhemoglobin, it is hyperacute. With this intracellular deoxyhemoglobin, it is acute. It is methemoglobin, it is subacute phase, and when it is hemosiderin, it is chronic phase. Mnemonics are there, but most we can identify as when it is hyperintense on T1 weighted images, it indicates a subacute stage. When it is hypointense on both, it is chronic. When it is hyperintense on T2 and isointense on T1, it is hyperacute. When it is iso to hypointense on both, it is acute hemorrhage. Thank you.
Thank you. Next,
I have a patient, a 70-year-old female patient who had no specific complaints, who came for a master health checkup for a USG abdomen.
the ultrasound abdomen through the epigastrium revealed a diffusely hypoechoic and bulky pancreatic head. And on the color Doppler, we can see there are multiple tangles of vessels noted within the pancreatic head. Based upon these findings, in order to categorize the lesion, we did a CT abdomen. These are the plain arterial and the venous face images of the patient. Here in the arterial face, we can see the pancreatic head appears bulky as compared with the body, with diffusely hypodense appearance. In the arterial face, here we can see multiple tangles of vessels noted in the pancreatic head, and we can see the early opacification of the portal vein with washout in the venous face. Based upon the findings of multiple tangles of vessels in the arterial phase with early enhancement of the portal vein in the arterial phase with washout in the venous phase, we made a diagnosis of pancreatic AVM. Pancreatic AVM are very rare, and it was first described by Halpern in a patient with Osler-Rendo and Weber disease. Most commonly, it occurs in the pancreatic head, and the mean age of at the time of diagnosis will be 52 years. They can be either congenital, which is most common cause, with 90% of the patients, 90% of the cases being congenital, or acquired lesions due to any neoplasms, inflammation, or after trauma. Imaging findings, again in the CT we can see multiple discrete intrapancreatic vessels which are best seen in the arterial phase with early opacification of the portal vein. DSA is the gold standard, and however it's an invasive method. Here again we see dilated tortuous feeding arteries with dense straining of the pancreas as seen here, with early filling of the portal vein and clearance of the pancreatic stain. The complications of pancreatic AVM include rupture of the AVM, presence of any esophageal or gastric varices secondary to the portal hypertension caused by the AVM, or any GI hemorrhage which occurs because of the rupture of the AVM into the pancreatic duct or portal hypertension, and again it can lead to pancreatitis also. Treatment can be either any endovascular or a surgical procedure. Endovascular procedures include arterial embolization or portovenous shunting. Sometimes in patients who present with comorbidities, we can also have a policy of wait and watch with no treatment at all. Differential diagnoses include islet cell tumors, which are neuroendocrine tumors, then cystadenocarcinomas, sarcomas, and metastasis.
Thank you. Next, I have a case from Aishwarya, consultant radiologist from Kaveri General.
Good evening. My first case is a young male, 24 years old, who presented with vague abdominal pain for 1 week. And on clinical examination, he had a hard lump in the right iliac fossa region. Hence, a plain CT abdomen was done first, which showed an ill-defined soft tissue density, which was abutting in the region of the iliocecal junction, abutting the medial wall of the cecum, and it's causing extrinsic impression. Contrast study was done, which showed a homogeneously enhancing irregular soft tissue density lesion in the iliocecal region, causing extrinsic impression over the medial wall of cecum. However, there is no enhancing lesion within the cecum. There were also few adjacent small enhancing nodes seen. Based on the above findings, the possibility of an inflammatory etiology was suggested, possibly an appendicular mass, and the patient was given a course of antibiotics, and the CT was again repeated. However, the repeat CT did not show any significant interval change, and the patient was taken up for surgery. Intra-op, a firm mass was seen in the iliocecal region with extensive surrounding adhesions, and resection of the lesion was done along with right hemicolectomy because the lesion was could not be separated from the cecum, and the HP came out to be fibromatosis of cecum. Intra-abdominal fibromatosis, it is a benign mesenchymal lesion which can occur anywhere throughout the GI tract, and it is also the most common primary tumor of the mesentery, and it can develop in any age. However, it is a very rare lesion, and they are locally aggressive tumors that tend to recur when incompletely resected. The imaging findings, they usually appear as a mass-like or infiltrative lesion with ill-defined wall thickening of the mesentery. In the CT, they appear as an homogeneous mass, either isodense or hyperdense relative to the muscle, and may show infiltrative margins. They usually show enhancement post-contrast. The MRI will show features suggestive of a fibrous lesion with low intensity on T1 and variable intensity on T2 weighted images. Another DD for this lesion could be a GIST, However, a GIST will be a solid lesion with central necrotic area showing peripheral enhancement. My next case is a 49-year-old female who came to Master checkup for ultrasound, and incidentally, an adnexal lesion was picked up. She had no other complaints. MRI was done for the patient, which showed a well-defined lesion in the left adnexa with a heterogeneous signal, predominantly hyperintense on both T2 and T1 weighted images. And there is partial suppression of the hyperintensity on T1 weighted fat suppressed images, which suggests macroscopic fat. There were also few T1, T2 hyperintense nodules within the lesion, which are probably Rokitansky nodules. This CT screening was done for the same patient, which shows fat density lesion in the adnexa. This is a dermoid of the ovary, which is the most common ovarian neoplasm. It is a slow encapsulated tumor composed of ectodermal, mesodermal, and endodermal elements. And the solid components seen within the lesion may be hair follicles, calcification, and Rokitansky nodules, which are important because they have a high chance to undergo malignant transformation. And the Rokitansky nodules may be seen as mural hyperechogenicity with calcification, fluid levels. Usually, there's no internal vascularity. In CT, it is a predominantly fat density lesion with fluid levels and calcification. Malignant transformation may be suspected when the size is more than 10 centimeter, or post contrast you can see any enhancing soft tissue components. In MRI, fat suppression can be used to confirm the presence of fat, and solid components usually show enhancement. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Aishwarya, and thank you one and all for your patient hearing. We'll be back again with the end of next month with an even more interesting set of cases. Thank you.